Okay, so this is why I don't use a dip belt for weighted pull-ups and dips and instead use dumbbells. This is probably one of the things that I've been most approached about in the gym. And so for some frame of reference, the most that I've done, at least within reason of my current standards, would be 90 pounds working weight for dips and 50 for pull-ups. And I have used a dip belt before. I got one during lockdown, but aside from then, I've always used dumbbells. And so I'm just going to be going over why I do it, how I do it, and some things that I have considered or discovered throughout my experience over the years. So reasons why I use a dumbbell over a dip belt. I have about 6 of them here, but I'll start by saying that over time, my reasoning has changed, or there are more reasons that come up as to why I continue to use a dumbbell over a dip belt. But the first one would be habit. I don't think that I even knew that a dip belt existed when I first started doing pull-ups and dips. The gym that I went to at the time was just really small, and I don't think pull-ups and dips were movements that their target members did. And so when I felt like I could do more than body weight, my natural inclination was to add more weight. And so I just went and grabbed a dumbbell. By the time that I did learn of dip belts and I had switched gyms, I didn't think it was worth putting one on for 5, 10, 20 pounds. And so as I was able to do more weight, the dumbbells still felt fine, and so I just kept using them and never felt like it was necessary to change anything. So reason number 1 would just be habit. The next few reasons are more practical. Reason number 2 is that I just think dumbbells are easier and more convenient in terms of logistics and setting up. With a belt, I have to take it on and off, load and unload plates. If I use my own belt, I have to take it to and from the gym. Or if I use one at the gym, I have to go and find one. And so for the sake of simplicity, I just prefer dumbbells. Reason number 3, this one pertains more to dips than pull-ups, but it would be safety. Nothing happens if I fail a pull-up. I just can't pull anymore, but failing dips is riskier. With a belt, the weight is attached to me, whereas if I use a dumbbell and I can't do a rep, I can just drop it. And I don't typically aim for absolute failure when I do pull-ups and dips, but things can happen. Whether it's a misgroove, I overestimate how much I have left in the tank, or I'm just having an off day. And this wasn't an issue at my previous gyms, but at my current gym, I don't know how much it comes across on camera, but the bars are really high. They are almost as tall as me, and I mean, I'm not that tall, but relatively speaking, they're still pretty high. And I have tried lowering myself down with the dumbbell during my warm-up weights before, just to see what it would feel like if I was using an actual belt. And it bothered my shoulders. And because I only ever fail at the bottom portion of a rep, where I feel like my shoulders are in their most compromised position, there's no guarantee that I would be able to safely and comfortably do it from that height if I was using actual working weight. And so from that perspective, I just feel more comfortable using a dumbbell so I can keep my shoulders. The next reason, number 4, would be the psychological factor of seeing plates. This one also pertains more to dips than pull-ups just because the weights are greater, but dumbbells pretty much all look the same after a while, and I would rather not be reminded that this is actual weight that is in addition to my own body weight that I am trying to either push or pull. You can compare this to barbell squat or bench. Sometimes people, instead of using a 45-pound plate, they will use multiple smaller plates, which can help mitigate any mental blocks or just make the weights less intimidating. And again, this wasn't an issue when I was doing lighter weights, but is something that I started to take into account the past couple years or so. The last 2 reasons are more personal preference. Reason number 5 is that most belts come with a chain, which I personally find to be a little flashy and noisy and attract a lot of attention. And I don't think this is completely a public gym setting kind of thing, because I didn't even like using my own belt that has a chain when I was using it at home by myself. So I think it's just a little too noisy for my liking. And I also think I have a thing where I don't really like when people can see what weights I'm doing, which I guess goes back to what I was saying about dumbbells pretty much all looking the same. And I know now that there are alternatives to a belt with a chain, but before I wasn't, so. The last reason, number 6, I don't think the belts at the gyms ever got cleaned or maintained. So they were always kind of grimy from being on the floor and kicked around and whatnot. So it just made me kind of not want to use them, if I'm being honest. But that's basically it. These 6 reasons weren't necessarily in chronological order or order of significance, but the 2 biggest ones at the moment would just be habit and safety. The second part that I'm going to go over is something that I've also been asked before, which is how I do it. I'm going to go ahead and add on perceived difficulty and impact on training, just because most people assume that using a dumbbell is more difficult. But what I do is I place the dumbbell between my knees. There's like a little nook at my knees where the handle can rest nice and snug. And as I move into position to start a set, my ankles will naturally cross behind me, which will help lock the dumbbell into place. I do somewhat need to actively think about pressing my knees together throughout the duration of a set, but again, habit, and you get used to it, and then it becomes an afterthought. So I try to keep the dumbbell at my knees for as long as possible, and if it does fall to my ankles, it's by accident. That can either make it more or less difficult depending on how early or late I am into a set. Too early can make it more difficult just because it has a tendency to slip at the ankles. Towards the end is still manageable, sometimes even easier, and I've even had a hard time unlocking my ankles to release the dumbbell. But the dumbbell slipping down to my ankles happens all the time, mainly for dips, but the dumbbell starting to slip out of my ankles where I feel like I'm not able to hold on anymore has only impacted a handful of sets over all the years that I've been doing this. And I will say that The dumbbell almost has never fallen off to the ground because of my inability to hold it. I think only twice, but those instances were because I was already overly tired and fatigued going to those sessions. But other than that, I don't feel like holding a dumbbell takes that much more energy or focus to do. There is a slight adjustment period whenever I go up to a new weight for the first time, but you get used to it pretty quickly, and the longer you do it, the more practice you have. So I just think doing pull-ups and dips with a dumbbell isn't as significant of a limiting factor as maybe a lot of people might assume it to be. And to put it into perspective, a few years ago, somebody asked me whether I would be able to hold on to 70 for dips. At the time, my working weight was 45, and I replied that I could barely hold on to that. I barely warm up with 45 now, and 70 doesn't feel like much either. So you'd be surprised how far you can go with dumbbells. So the last section, miscellaneous items that I figure I might as well include but didn't know where else to put. Number one would be that for dips, I do put rubber mats on the floor below me for when the dumbbell drops, just because that area of the gym doesn't have appropriate protective flooring. And I'm not trying to completely wreck property. So that's that. The next one would be that dumbbells may be a better option for drop sets than a dip belt, especially if you are just dropping down to body weight. I personally don't do drop sets for pull-ups and dips for other reasons, but I have tried it before and it works pretty well. Miscellaneous tidbit number 3 would be that holding a dumbbell does use your hamstrings because you're basically just doing an isometric hold. And so while I did say that holding a dumbbell doesn't require that much more effort, it's gotta stay there somehow. And so you are still using your muscles. The last one is probably the most fun one, which is that I used to get a ton of bruises and scrapes on my legs and down my shins from the dumbbell. Not so much anymore, which is strange because I don't do anything different, but fair warning if for whatever reason anybody decides that they want to give it a shot. But that basically covers most of what I want to say for now. I didn't want to get too nitty-gritty, and I haven't actually explained all of this in detail before. Usually when people ask, I just tell them it's habit, or that I just think it's easier to keep my answer short and sweet. But I didn't learn to use a dumbbell from anywhere. There's nothing special about using a dumbbell. It's not a special technique. There's no special benefit. You're not going to be able to do more weight if you use a dumbbell. It's just sharing something, I guess, that people have regularly come up to me about. But I know that eventually I will likely have to go back to using a belt again because my gym is running out of dumbbells.